into my first session of the class in Introduction to Anthropology as a sophomore student at Wheaton College. And the person who taught that class, believe it or not, is present with us now, 60 years later. Bob Wells, will you stand up? Well, Bob doesn't recall it, but he was the man. That's the first time I ever met him. And, of course, later on, we moved to Redlands, and Bob moved to Redlands, and we became friends. And the other person I want to introduce is my bicycle buddy. We've been riding bicycles together for almost 40 years. We've had a dozen trips to Australia biking, and, in fact, we leave again on November 17 for a 2-week bicycle trip in Australia. And Kirk Howard, would you stand up? Dr. Kirk Howard is an anesthesiologist. And as an anesthesiologist, you know, he puts people to sleep. But he puts them to sleep just one at a time. And I told him, from my experience, I can put 100 people to sleep at once. Standing here, I have a lot of glare from these windows, and I can't really make out your faces very well. So if you come to church and you're tired and you're yawning, sit over here in this section, and the pastor will not pick up on that. I used to preach every Sunday until I retired from my church, and preaching is a challenge. You have to come up with another sermon every week. That's a lot of pressure. And Steve last week asked me how I felt about preaching today, and I said, I'm just so excited I can't wait to hear what I'm going to say. I want to talk this morning about some really serious issues in the Christian walk. I want to talk about Jesus as Redeemer. And as it said in Job, my Redeemer lives. I rejoice that my Redeemer lives. I went down to Atlanta, Georgia for 3 months of cancer treatment. And I visited a church there called First Redeemer Church. It's a large church. Had 2 services in the Sunday morning. Each one would seat 5,000 people. It was really a big church. And after I worshiped there, I asked myself, well, First Redeemer, are there other Redeemers? Is there a second Redeemer? Is there a third Redeemer? And what does Jesus redeem us from? Well, this morning I don't want to talk about salvation. I want to talk about in the Christian walk. What does Jesus have to do with redeeming in our Christian walk? And the first thing that comes to mind, of course, is tragedy. Tragedy is something that we run into in our Christian life. I don't think there's any person, Christian or not, who hasn't come face to face with tragedy. If not, you just haven't lived long enough. There's enough tragedy in the world to go around. And I'm sure that almost every person here today has come face to face with tragedy. Last month on TV, Stephen Colbert was being interviewed by Anderson Cooper. And Stephen Colbert shared how, as a 10-year-old, his father died. But now, he said, I see that as a blessing. And Anderson Cooper did a double take. You could see how shocked he was. How could that ever be a blessing? In what way could that horrible thing be a blessing? And so Stephen went on to share about the effect of that loss and what it did in his family and the good things that came out of it. And that's why, looking back all these years, he can say it was a blessing. Well, I could do the same thing I lost my father when I was 14, and at that time it was the greatest tragedy that I had ever experienced, and I think probably in life it's the greatest tragedy that I've had since. I've had no other tragedy like it, because he was this fine, upstanding man, a great father, and suddenly he was gone from a massive heart attack. Well, what that did in my life was it drove me into the arms of God. We did not go to church. We had no religious background. And the question came to my mind, God, if there is a God, how could you let my father, who was a good man, die? And I so wanted to find the answer to that I started reading in the New Testament, and a year and a half later, I read the words in John chapter 20 that say that these things are written that you might believe, and that believing you might have life in his name. And when I read those words, I knew that I was a believer. I didn't have any emotional experience. I didn't have any goosebumps, nothing. It was just a certain knowledge in my head that I was indeed a believer in Jesus Christ. And then I started out trying to find a church where I knew I would find other believers. And I believe from the bottom of my heart that I would not be standing here today in front of you if it were not for the death of my father. And I can agree with Stephen Colbert today, after all these years, that it is now a blessing. I can see the blessing, how it flowed through all those years, and how I came to an understanding of faith that affected my entire life. Well, there are lots of tragedies in the world. We know that. We read the newspapers about horrible tragedies. Let's just take shootings, for example. What do you say to a mother who sent her child off to school and the child was killed in a shooting? I mean, this is unbelievable. I mean, when I was in school in the 40s and 50s, that was unheard of. It was unknown. Jesus is the Redeemer. So we need to put that together with these tragedies. What does redeem mean? It means, most literally, to buy back again. There are also some other dictionary meanings that I've written down here, some of which are a bit of a stretch for this context. But it says right here, compensate for the faults or bad aspects of a situation. Freedom from captivity, deliverance. In its basic sense, redeem is to make it good again. How in the world could God make good on the death of a father, and that young man grows up missing him so terribly in life? But he does. Now, I'm not saying that we're always going to see that redeeming. We may not live to see the redeeming of Jesus in a situation, but if not in this life, I know in the next life. Jesus can redeem. He is the first Redeemer. Are there other Redeemers? Yes. There's a second Redeemer. And there's a third Redeemer. And there are probably a fourth Redeemer. Some are good and some are bad. A bad one would be trying to redeem the situation by getting into alcohol. If I can't change the situation, I'm going to drink it away. Well, that raises a whole host of other issues. And you end up worse than when you started. But then there's another Redeemer that's a good Redeemer, and that is getting counseling, psychotherapy. Those are designed to make bad situations good. But no matter what the situation, the first Redeemer that we should go to as believers in Jesus is Jesus Christ himself, knowing that he can redeem. And that gives us so much courage to face life. You know, when I was graduating from Wheaton College with my diploma in my hand, I was 22. I was only the second person in my family ever to graduate from college. I thought I had the world by the tail. I didn't know how difficult it would be to live through life. I didn't realize the things that I would come up against. I didn't realize the way that life would come down on me. Because if we live life, not only do we face tragedy, we face brokenness. Brokenness happens when we come up against the vicissitudes of life and we can do nothing else about it. I think of divorce. Divorce is nothing but a world of brokenness. Many of you have experienced it. And it's kind of like a living death in the sense that the person whom you loved is not there anymore in that way. And so you mourn that relationship. The relationship died, but not the person. It used to be, that divorced Christians were second-class citizens. There are still churches today where a divorced person cannot teach Sunday school. I mean, that to me, I just can't believe that. Because being divorced does not make you a second-class citizen. It simply means that relationships were shattered, and what you do as a Christian is you pick up and go on with life. Another situation with the idea of brokenness is we end up sometimes in life being hurt with other relationships. How about family relationships? I'll bet you half of the families have brokenness in their family relationships. You have a son who doesn't talk to the father, and they haven't talked together in a dozen years. You have a grandmother who doesn't talk to a grandchild. I know a family where the mother and father raised the daughter who was a year older than me, and the daughter then fell in love with a young man. He wasn't appreciated, and so they ran off and got married, and that cut the relationship. And then they had children, and the parents knew nothing about them, never met the children. It wasn't until the oldest child was about 12 that they finally came together again. Isn't that awful? And then the story goes on, because the youngest daughter, who was 10, went on to grow up, and she fell in love with a man who wasn't appreciated, and so she ran off and got married. And then that generation was cut off. I mean, history repeats itself. We are so in chains. We are so bound by our relationships. But Jesus can redeem them. How do you change a broken relationship? I don't really know. Prayer is a good thing. A man at a church in Michigan, after I spoke there on this very topic, came up to me and said, well, the way I changed it, he said, I went to visit my brother, hadn't spoken in 12 years. They both live in the same town in Michigan. He got to the house surrounded by a great chain link fence with a gate and a guard dog. And he opened the gate and let himself in. The guard dog attacked him. And the brother came out of the house. And when the brother saw the blood running down out of his legs, it changed his heart. And they came together after years and years of being split. So the blood was the redeemer in that situation. Jesus is the one who is the first redeemer, and we can rejoice that our Redeemer lives. And then we have the third area, and that is there are things in our life that we can't control. Now, it could be, just be a habit, or it could be a disease. I remember when the doctor sat me down and said, Mr. Walker, you have prostate cancer. And you know what I said to him? I was speechless. And then the first thing I said to him was, Doctor, you must be mistaken. Because you see, while I was pastoring a church, I was a hospice chaplain at the same time. And I visited people with cancer. I didn't have cancer, so it couldn't be me. But it was me. And there was nothing that I could do about that. I had prostate cancer. Now, one person in my church said to me, Pastor, what did you do? What sin did you commit that made God strike you down with cancer? And I didn't even have to think about that. I said to him, you know, the God that I know and love is not an ogre. He does not strike down his followers out of anger, but he gives them grace and mercy and peace. And those are the things that overflow us. When the doctor tells us we have cancer, we can go to the Lord, and that's what we can receive, because Jesus can redeem even cancer. The first 2 weeks, I was in shock. I really was. I was in a form of grief. And I kept asking God, Lord, how could I have cancer? And I got the answer just before Christmas. And you know what it was? In just 2 weeks, God gave me the answer. God's answer was, why not? You're human. You live in this world. If you live in a world of brokenness, in a world of disease, you are going to get broken. You are going to have disease. But when we do, we can turn to the first Redeemer. You know, actually, I call it my radiation vacation in Atlanta. It wasn't so bad because when I had to get up at night to go to the bathroom, I didn't need a flashlight. And it was painless. And it was a demonstration of what science has done and how they can cure a disease so painlessly. And that too modern medicine is a kind of a redeemer. It makes it good again. But the first Redeemer is always Jesus. How about habits? Can God redeem us from habits? We had a deacon who showed up at church one Sunday, and he was drunk. I mean, he was really drunk. And he made a fool of himself. That was unfortunate. So 2 days later, after he had sobered up, I brought over a half a dozen of the deacons, and we visited him. We prayed with him, talked with him, counseled with him. We did what the Bible says to be done, that if a brother sins, you go to him with the elders. He was so embarrassed that he never came back to church. Within a month, he had moved away. Almost 20 years later, he came back. I was still the pastor of the church. He was such a wonderful man. And he thanked me for the intervention that we had done, because he went out and got the help that he needed to deal with his alcoholism. He had moved back east to his hometown, and with family around him, he kicked the alcohol habit, went to the AA. He became successful in business. It was just a testimony to what we can do in the church. We are not designed to carry these burdens alone. God does not want you to be the broken person described by Thoreau in 1848 when he said, most people, this is a paraphrase, most people live lives of quiet desperation. God does not want you to be that person of desperation. We need to share with each other. If you've been through tragedy and it's still rollicking in your life, and if you have brokenness and you're still trying to recover, and if you're still dealing with issues beyond your control, like disease, you need to pray with a fellow believer. Disease comes to us. We don't ask for it. You never know when you're going to wake up and have some disease. And just wait till you get older. Some of you youngsters don't realize that. But just wait until you get into your 70s and 80s and surprise, a new disease raises its ugly head. We have people in our congregation where the husband is caring for the wife who has Alzheimer's. Or the wife is caring for the husband who has Alzheimer's. And that's the fulfillment of the marriage vows. And what's the solution to that as Christians? We can't fix Alzheimer's, but we can lean upon each other in prayer. We can share the burden. And I don't want you to leave here today bearing the same burdens that you walked in with, those of tragedy, brokenness, and things out of control. But I want you to be able to share, if you're willing, with somebody. And as soon as the service is over, I've got the whole prayer team that's going to meet down here to pray with anyone who wants just a 1-minute prayer. It's not going to be long. If you're with somebody, they'll wait. So that when you leave here, you'll feel that part of that burden is lifted. And that's totally up to you. I know that my Redeemer liveth. He is the first Redeemer.